Today's webinar will cover closing more business in a down economy, and hosting is Sean Casemore, author, keynote speaker, and chief sales accelerator at Casemore & Company, Inc. In today's session, we'll learn how to create a sense of urgency to close the sale without reducing its price, increase the size of every sale to generate more revenue with less effort, how to engage your network to sell on your behalf. Sean is an expert in sales, driven by a passion to help business owners, executives, and sales leaders accelerate their sales results. As a keynote speaker and virtual speaker, he enables companies, their leaders, and teams to accelerate their sales results. A prolific writer, Sean frequently writes about best practices and proven strategies to generate more sales. Sean is the author of The Unstoppable Sales Machine, right behind him, and insights can be found online in publications such as Fast Company, Plant Magazine, and Inc. Magazine, to name a few. Now, just for some quick housekeeping rules, please note that all of attendees have been placed on mute today for the duration of the webinar, and that you can ask questions or make comments using the chat function in your Zoom dashboard. They'll be addressed at the end during the Q&A. This webinar is recorded and will be sent to all of our attendees soon after. For those of us on the CPSA designation pathway, maintaining your professional development units, this session is worth 1 professional development unit. As a new CPSA offering, brand new, all attendees will receive a certificate of participation accompanying the recording after the session, and can be downloaded and shared on LinkedIn. Now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Sean to start.
Great. Thank you very much, Rupalyn, and welcome everybody to today's, I'd like to call it a conversation, although I realize it's probably somewhat one-sided. So I see somebody must still be unmuted there. There we go. All right, so let's get into it here. I think this topic is timely depending on what you sell and the market that you're in. So I always consider, where do we begin with a conversation like this? So, it struck me, a close friend of mine owns a series of automotive repair shops. His father started the business back in the 80s. They've got multiple shops as well as their own parts store. So they buy parts from themselves essentially, as well as sell to other companies. So many years ago, we're talking September 11th, 2001, if you recall, at that time, the economy took a big dive very suddenly. A lot of things came to a halt. And so at that time, we were spending a lot of time together. And I said to him one day, how is this going to affect your business? I mean, they're talking about going into a recession. What are you going to do? And he said, well, Sean, my business is recession proof. I thought, well, what does he mean, right? He does a lot of the selling for his business. And he said, well, when the economy is booming, people tend to go to dealerships for repairs. They're willing to pay the premium price. But when the economy slows, he said, they're more apt to come to my shop because our rates are a little more reasonable. We can get them used parts. And he went on. And I thought, oh, okay. So it sounds like the recession is the ideal time for your business. What do you do during boom times? He said, well, the solution he came up with there was that they asked themselves the question, what can we sell that, during boom times that everybody needs, that people are willing to pay for, that is going to help our business? And he ended up becoming one of the top Bridgestone Blizzak distributors, resellers, I guess you'd say, in Ontario and to some degree even across Canada. If you go by his shops today, there's multiple sea cans, mostly full of Blizzaks, sitting out in his parking lot. So the reason I share that with you is that when we come into these changes that tend to be happening, and they're going to impact different people in different ways, I think it's really about perspective to some degree. I know it can make us somewhat nervous and a little bit uneasy, especially with what we're hearing, maybe what we're seeing with different companies laying off and cutting people and cutting staff. But at the end of the day, it comes down to perspective. And think back to what my friend did, which is really to identify how can he position his business, whether it's boom or bust times, to ensure that he can continue to sell. So what do we know about today's economy? Well, again, depending on what you're selling, what we do know is interest rates continue to climb. At least the rumor is there may be another increase. That's both in Canada and the US. Additionally, we see taxes continue to increase. You're going to see, I think, another tax increase here in April on the carbon side of things, which you and I both know is going to affect everything, because almost everything gets transported, and that will affect fuel. And therefore, we're going to see costs continue to go up. So, but what does this mean in terms of the people we're selling to? Well, from a company standpoint, if you're selling capital equipment or something that is very capital intensive and is high cost, obviously companies are slowing down on their spending. Doesn't mean they don't have the money, but they're holding back. And what I'm seeing in the industry is many companies are saying, well, we have the money, but we're not sure where the economy is going, so we're going to sit on this. Now, if you remember, that's what happened at the beginning of COVID. Companies still had money, but they decided to sit on it and wait. And what was the result? A boom. And I'm not a futurist. I'm not a prediction type person, but my guess is if we do see anything happen here, it's that companies are simply going to delay their purchases once again, and we're going to see a very quick uptick in large capital spends within the next year and a half. But that said, the other thing that's happening is the base costs of a lot of the products, so fuel, food, they're all going up for various reasons. And so again, companies don't necessarily have the spending cash to invest in whatever it is you're selling. So you might be thinking, okay, this is all great, Sean. Thanks for depressing me. We're 7 minutes into a presentation and you've told me what I already know. But let me just share with you then something that we've talked about before. If you were on my last presentation, probably about 8 months ago, I shared this with you then. If you didn't see it with me, you've probably seen it out there. Gartner did a study and they released it in the very end of 2020 in December. And what the study was relative to B2B. So if you're selling B2B, they tried to figure out where is time being spent when it comes to B2B sales. When they had really two findings. One is where time is spent, and the second is what you see in the title of this slide, which is that ultimately a lot of buying decisions today are being made by groups of people rather than just one person. Now, to some degree, I've looked at that to say, well, there's the decision maker, but then there's decision influencers. And I think decision influencers have maybe a more influence than they have in previous years. But here's what I want to suggest. What that study showed was that about 27% of a buyer's time is spent researching online, right, before they make the purchase decision or the buy decision. 22% of the time is spent meeting with their internal decision influencers, the internal buying group, to discuss different ideas, different research, and trying to come up with that end decision. 18% is spent researching independently offline, so going to trade shows and conferences, calling up peers. And then 16%, if you go through the study, is spent on a variety of other things. What that really means to us in sales is that only 17% of their time on average is spent with us, the sales professional. And worse yet, that 17% is divided by the number of suppliers or salespeople that they're meeting with. So if they're meeting with 3 people in sales, 3 different companies, you get 5 whatever the decimal place is here of their total time. Here's what I want to suggest to you, and I think you would agree with this. When it comes to the economy slowing and all the factors we discussed a minute ago, I think you would agree that a lot of buyers and companies as a whole are spending more time researching, right? So what's actually going to happen is this 27% and maybe even the 18% is going to increase, right? And what that likely means is a little less time with us. So the trend is not going in our favor. We've got less and less time with our buyers, particularly when the economy is down. Why? Because they're doing more research to try and figure out, is now the right time to buy? Is this the best solution? Is this the best price? Whereas during boom times, not as much time is spent on research. So this is not necessarily good for us unless we practice some of the strategies that I'm going to share with you here today. So here's something I want you to consider then, just going forward. And this is a way to kind of frame this relative to you and how you invest your mindset or shift your mindset relative to dealing with slower economic times. There's really 2 things then, considering all this, that you and I can control during economic slowdowns, right? There's our focus, what we focus on, what we choose to focus on. And then there's our actions, the degree and level of actions we take, right, in order to pursue that focus. Now, if you're somebody who you don't have a lot of focus, so the market slows down and you're not really focusing on who you're wanting to pursue, why you're pursuing them, what's going to be valuable to them in a down economy, if your focus is low and you don't put a lot of activity behind that, you're probably going to find yourself unemployed. I hate to say that, but you're not going to achieve any results and you're probably going to be in the line somewhere. Now, what if you've got great focus? So you become very strategic on who you're pursuing, what your value prop is, what your value proposition is, excuse me, what you're sharing with them. So your focus is high, but again, your activity is low. You're kind of waiting, well, is now the right time? They seem to be distracted because the economy's down, they're in meetings. Well, you're probably going to be caught in that overthinking, overanalyzing bucket where you're worried about what's going to happen and you're not taking enough action to actually make something happen, right? We all know sales to some degree is an activity-based role. The more activity you create, the more results you'll generate, but you have to be focused in those activities. Now, this other one here, and actually I did create, look at this, I did create little circles. I'm not even using them. The technology here is unbelievable. On the bottom right, if your focus is low, but your activity is high, and I'll admit, I'll put my hand up. I'm the first person to tell you when things slow down, I just generate more activity, right? Got to call more people, got to have more meetings, but there's a problem. Am I meeting with the right people? Am I talking to the right people? Do these people have budget that they're willing to spend, right? So the problem with that approach, when your focus is low and your activities are high, you just end up being everybody's friend. You're out there, you're having lunches and meals and coffees, but you're not really selling anything because you're not focusing in the right ways and in the right areas. Where we really want to be is this upper right corner. Now, that is not meant to be a take on the title of my book. It just happens to work out that way. But in my view, if you really want to be unstoppable as a sales professional, whether the economy is good or bad, think back to my example of Mike's garage, right? My friend Mike, if you really want to be unstoppable, you've always got to be focused on who we're pursuing and how we best pursue them. And then we've got to have a level of activity that's sufficient enough to achieve outcomes. And that also ensures that our focus is nimble. We're able to change our focus depending on the economy, because who I focus on in boom times may be very different than who I focus on from a target or a prospect standpoint during slower times. Okay, so this is what you can control. All that other stuff, it's noise. Might be difficult to hear. You might get bummed out about it. I would just suggest one thing. Do not start your day out with the news. I know some of you are going to hate me for saying that. You love listening to the news in the morning. I would not suggest it, because at the end of the day, it becomes very difficult, right? We're listening to all this negativity for the most part. That does not set your day up well to start picking up the phone and calling people. So if there's one tip you take away, if you're a news listener in the morning, try a week without listening to it, see how you feel. I think you'll find it helps. So ultimately then, here's what I mean by focus. So I've talked about actions. We're going to talk about some, let's say, unique actions that you can take that are important during these slow times. I mean, I'm not here to tell you, make some cold calls or attend some events. You already know that. I'm going to talk about some different things, but I want to talk specifically about what do I mean by focus, because that's what's important during times like this when the economy is slower. So what I want you to do is focus on ideal accounts. Now, you might not use the word accounts. You might use clients, customers, call them what you will, but focus on those ideal targets that you want to pursue. So those include, okay, here's a list of how you can define those ideal accounts. They're those targets or accounts that your existing customers can refer you into. I mean, what better source of new leads during economic downtimes than to go to existing customers who are still paying their bills, they're still happy with whatever it is you sell, and you say, hey, how are things going? I wanted to spend some time checking in. Right. And by the way, sometimes just doing that, having that call can reduce that anxiety if things are slow. Whenever COVID hit, a lot of the clients I was coaching panicked, right? Because suddenly, oh my gosh, I can't go see anybody. I said, just start calling every one of your accounts and just checking in, see how they're doing. That led to conversations, which in turn led to sales, right? So think about, who are my existing customers that are doing well? They likely know other companies, other accounts. It could be their competitor, and maybe or maybe not. Do they want to share that? That depends. But they probably know other companies, other organizations that could use your products or services that they could refer you to. And what an easy way to get your foot in the door, especially when times are tough and people don't want to hear necessarily from outside sources. You want to focus on companies or sectors that are in a growth mode. So healthcare, grocery, maintenance, right? So if I'm selling software and I can sell into the let's say the manufacturing sector and the healthcare sector, where am I going to focus during downtimes? I'm going to focus a lot of energy in healthcare. Healthcare might be a longer drawn out sale, but it's probably going to be a more secure sale maybe than the manufacturers who are cutting back on costs, right? Easy to reach decision makers and decision influencers. This goes back to this is something you want to focus on all the time. Can I reach the right people here? If you spend too much time with people that can't buy from you, you'll end up wasting your time. You're not going to be successful, and you're going to be overall bummed out about your success in sales. We've got to always focus on pursuing the right people, the decision makers and decision influencers. Can you reach them? Can you get in touch with them, right? Our companies that you want to be pursuing are those that are in a positive cash flow situation. Now you might say, well, Sean, I don't know what their cash flow situation is. Okay, well, are they laying off people? Have they been in the news? If you are somebody who is, and I doubt anybody here is doing this, but if you're selling to, and I have a client who was, to Silicon Valley Bank, yeah, probably not a good situation. If you haven't heard, They've been taken over by regulators. They've laid off a ton of people as a bank, right? And other banks are following suit in the United States. So there is a clear sign when they started laying off people that, hey, maybe I'm not going to pursue Silicon Valley Bank because they're not doing well. So just by checking in with the media, not watching the news, personally, I go to WSJ.com and globalmail.com in the morning and I skim the business section, which gives you quick highlights on what's happening. If you see layoffs, okay, maybe I avoid that. If you see a company that's hiring, right, hold on, maybe this is somebody I can pursue. They're located in a region that's easily accessible. You may find if the economy slows that your own company says, hey, we've got to cut back on travel costs. And here's how I think this is going to go. We've got to cut back on travel costs. And I know I told you to get out in the road. I had to push you out of the office after COVID. I told you, get out there, go see people. Now I'm saying, you know what? Hold on a second. We were able to do pretty well that virtual thing. Why don't you come back in the office, cut down the expenses? I think that's what we're going to experience here. So you might as well be proactive and say, well, if I'm going to pursue an account or a prospect, let me make sure it's somebody that I can reasonably reach those people. They're easily accessible, either by a direct flight, a low-cost flight. I can drive to see them, right? So you'll want to focus on that because I almost guarantee you those kind of, I won't say crackdowns, but those kind of guidelines are going to come into place here probably pretty quickly. And also, they've historically survived economic turndowns. And that really, to me, comes back to how long have they been in business? Okay. There are a lot of companies that were started during COVID that are not doing well or not in existence today. What is the bike? Is it the Peloton bike? I think that, it was interesting that during COVID, when nobody could go to a gym, Peloton sales, as did all other fitness equipment, went through the roof. They were selling like crazy. And the company scaled up and started producing more. Everything was great. And all of a sudden, gyms opened up, the world opened up, Peloton bike sales went down, and they seemed surprised. They're like, wow, what's going on with our sales? They started laying off people. Well, we have to focus on those companies that have survived previously. Now, if you sell to startups, okay, I'm going to suggest that you want to take a look at the startup and what are they going to be launching? It could be a kind of software that they're launching or a market they're launching into. Is that market or software already somewhat proven? Because if somebody's coming up with something completely new for an entirely new region or sector, chances of them being highly successful during economic downtimes, it could happen. Maybe they're supporting healthcare, but there's also a chance it might not work out. So you want to just be assessing. So this is a way to really make sure that any time you spend, those activities you spend are focused on pursuing your ideal accounts. That's where the biggest bang for your buck is going to be when it comes to economic slowdown. Because let's be honest, just better activities or more activities is not necessarily the solution. We've got to be very, very focused. Okay. So with that said, let me just give you an example of this. So many years ago, one of the items that I sold was metal brackets. That's right. I know you're excited. I know it's riveting. Metal brackets of all shapes and sizes, of all different coatings. But here's the thing that I found that I learned very quickly in the role of selling these brackets and visiting different companies who buy metal brackets, which there are some very large companies, as you might imagine. John Deere would be one that you would recognize. So in visiting, what I found early on is that, okay, everybody's using brackets. And I thought, this is going to be great. This is an easy sale. Everybody needs brackets, right? Well, there's a problem. After meeting with one gentleman at Caterpillar, we had a couple meetings. I showed him some pictures, like you see here, of our brackets. I talked about how long we've been in business, and he seemed like a great guy, seemed interested. So during that second meeting, I thought, okay, I'm going to try here to see if I can identify upcoming projects where we could provide some samples, right? See if I can get my foot in the door. And he said something to me that I've never forgotten. He said, Sean, we had our small talk, and then he said, Sean, let me stop you right here. Before we go any further, he says, we have a supplier, and in fact, a couple suppliers of metal brackets already. He said, if I was decide to try and incorporate your metal brackets somehow, I'm probably going to have to get rid of one of my current suppliers. And generally, we're happy with them. And he says, not only that, but it's going to have such a big, it's going to take so much time to work through this. It's going to be a big project, essentially, to try and bring in your brackets. Because he said, think about it. Once you decide you convince me, we've got to go and convince procurement. We've got to convince quality. We've got to set up logistics, right? We've got to make sure engineering is okay. He said, it's just too much work, Sean. I got to be honest with you, because you're telling me that you've got great brackets, you got a great history, and even your price is decent, but it's just too much work for us to go through and try and incorporate you. He says, what you really need to do is come back to me with a list of business impacts that impact all of these different departments to make my job in selling you internally much easier. I thought, oh my gosh, the light bulb went on. I thought, yeah, I'm not selling the buyer, the person that in this case, he was the plant manager, right? And he's the guy that ultimately signed off on the POs. I had to do his job for him, which was give the business impacts that could influence all the other departments that he in turn had to influence, right? Go back to that first drawing. And if you missed it, I talked about the fact that Gartner study you've probably seen before, where 27% of B2B buyers spend time online researching before they buy. And additionally, 18% of their time is spent offline researching. We said that in an economic slowdown, more time is going to be spent researching because people are unsure of making a decision. When it came to this case, this plant manager did not want to invest the time with his buying group and doing more research to convince them. He gave that job to me. And that's when the light bulb went on that really what I need to be able to do is to bring forward very clear business impacts, not at a high level necessarily, but impacts that impact each of the individuals, the decision influencers that are part of the buying decision. So this first step I want you to think about is not to forget about your value proposition. I mean, that's important, but a value proposition is oftentimes a few different statements that speak to the value your product can bring to the company or the organization. Instead, I want you to think about, and this is kind of more granular, think about who are the people that are influencers of the decision to buy my product, what are their titles, and what are the business impacts my product, and if you don't like the word impact, what's the benefit, the business benefit that my product or service can bring for them? So for procurement, it might be the fact that we're moving from 3 sources to 2, which should save them time. It might be the fact that I'm giving an extended warranty. For finance, it might be the fact I'm giving better payment terms if what I'm selling is something that's a high cost. I've got a client right now that one of the things we've shifted to here in the last 6 months is a rent to buy solution, because their capital equipment was about $500,000 for one piece of equipment. So obviously going into this economic turndown, they said, oh my gosh, right? People are already telling them, we're going to wait and see what happens. So I said, then what you want to do, they still need your equipment. They're still working. They still need upgrades. Why don't you create a rent to buy? And by doing so, they're actually able to make more money because the rental fee is very high. They're able to make profit off equipment ultimately, and they avoid some of the finance costs. It's a great scenario. So it's going to be different depending on what you're selling, but you've got to think about the decision influencers and the impact that your product or service, introducing it into their company, will have on them. And by doing so, you're going to reduce some of that research and make your buyer's life a lot easier when they're trying to introduce you as a new potential supplier. Now, here's what I want to ask you then. Many of you in the past that I've talked to when I've discussed business impacts, you've said, well, Sean, what's the formula for that? How do I figure out my business impact? So here's a simple formula. You can change this. This is not cast in stone. You can change this up, but I wanted to give you a starting place. So for example, your first part, consider what are the different benefits of using your product or service, and not just at a high level, but go back to the decision influencers and the benefits they might gain by using your product or service. Add to that any increase in revenue they might gain as a result of your product or service. So let's say for a moment you're selling insurance. I mean, insurance, if you're selling insurance, I'm not here to offend you, but insurance is insurance, right? Give me a little better coverage, give me a little better price, boom, right? Insurance. So at the end of the day though, if your product provides better coverage, can you quantify that coverage? And you can, because you can say, well, if this was to happen in our history and our knowledge, here's the impact on the company and here's the cost associated with that. So you can use scenarios to come up with what is the potential increased revenue if they buy our solution, right? So you've got to break this down into how is buying your product or service going to increase the revenue of the company? Because remember, we're in a slowdown. People are looking for more money. So if you can convert what you're selling to more money in their pocket, even though don't worry about the fact they've got to invest in your product or service. That's given, set that aside. Focus on how can we deliver more revenue for this company? Is it increased productivity, increased uptime, better coverage, et cetera, okay? Add that to any missed opportunity cost. So missed opportunity, you might say, well, I understand you've been using this kind of equipment for the last 5 years. If you would have had our equipment in place, you would have had this revenue that you just identified for the last 5 years, which totals X. So if it's $100,000 a year, savings and productivity that you've identified, then in the last 5 years, we would have saved you $500,000, which would have paid for our equipment. You see where I'm going with this? We start to create business impacts that ultimately you can calculate to more than justify the cost of your product or service, okay? And then last but not least, you may have a duration. Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. Again, it depends on what you're selling. But if there's a term that your product or service usually has, a 1-year term for insurance, for example, a 3-year term for financing, whatever the case might be, you might incorporate that as well. So this is meant to get you thinking, but how do you develop business impacts ultimately that you can share with your customers, your clients, your prospects, okay? And remember, the key here is that this isn't just the high level benefits. This is thinking about every single decision influencer who's part of the decision and what are the specific benefits your product or service might offer them. Now, one last point to raise here. You might be saying, okay, Sean, this makes sense. At least hopefully that's what you're thinking. This makes sense, but there's a problem. I don't know the potential benefits that my product or service can offer. I don't know what those impacts are for the decision influencers. I've only got my value prop and I've got some high level ideas. Then what you want to do is take some existing clients where you know them, call them, but call the people in the different areas, the different departments that you're wondering about. So let's say for a moment, you're selling a bracket, just like I was. You might call up an existing client or customer you've worked with for years and call somebody in engineering. Invariably, somebody in engineering has spoke with somebody at your company. You call them up, say, hey, Bob, it's Sean calling from ABC Company. We've been supplying you brackets for the last 10 years. I wonder if I could ask a quick question of you. So Bob says, okay, go ahead. You say, well, I'm just curious, when you moved to our brackets, what were the benefits or what are the benefits you find in using our brackets? Now, again, you may get silence. You may get blank stares if you do it in Zoom, right? But the reality here is that you can go back and ask existing clients, what is the impact, the positive impact that your product or service has? And by the way, this is something you should be doing anyways, because it constantly equips you with new ideas and new benefits, right? And new impacts that you can in turn share with your buyers, right? So I've got existing coaching clients that I have every week. They call one good client, one solid client, and I just have them do a brief check-in. But really the check-in is an interview to find out how are things going, right? But what are the benefits they're seeing from using their product or service? And then we're able to pull 1 or 2 nuggets out of that in order to use that with future prospects. For example, saying that some of our best clients have found X and Y as benefits. Now you're not guessing at it, you're using factual information. And by the way, if they volunteer that up pretty quickly, you can always ask for a testimonial. Hey, would you mind if we added this into a testimonial? I'm happy to write it up for you. You just determine if it's reasonable or not, right? So with that said, here's what I want to ask you. Quick question for the chat box. Oh, by the way, something you'll want to consider is any business impact you've identified previously or up until now may change during an economic slowdown. Why? Because your buyers, the companies you're selling to, may be facing new challenges that they didn't face before, right? They're facing higher financing than they have been previously if you're selling, right, finances. If you're selling investments and investments are down, right, you've got to realize that companies are looking for ways to make up the difference in the interest from the investments. So always be considering the current state, always be focusing on the current state of your buyers, of their companies, and make sure that the business impacts you're creating identify any new challenges as well as existing or past challenges that they've been facing, okay? All right, so that said, here's a quick chat box question for you. What are the business impacts, if you right off the top of your head, of not investing in your product or service today? So just throw them into the chat box. I'm gonna monitor here quickly if I can get my mouse to work. There we go. Whoop. So just note, what are some of the business impacts your product or service have on ultimately your customers or your prospects today? All right, so I see Greg noted something, a failure, so a drop in their pipeline. That's perfect, Greg. So Greg, just tell me, is it a reduction in their pipeline ultimately that's going to be the impact? And who else? Drop in. I'm not going to. Okay, great, Catherine. Thank you. I won't call out your last name. That way, nobody here is concerned about having something that maybe they don't want to share. Catherine, increased plastic consumption in healthcare consumables. So you're supporting healthcare. Increased plastic consumption is a no-no right now, right? Everybody. I just the other day opened up a loaf of bread, and for the first time ever, I realized the tab was made of cardboard, not plastic. I haven't seen that yet. Maybe I'm living in a little bit of a fishbowl, but nonetheless. Who else? So we've got Catherine, we've got Bruce, Missed out on available capacity in our system? Absolutely. Keep in mind, right, that coming out of COVID, people are overly sensitive right now to capacity because they've just gone through a period of time where your company might have been saying, yeah, we can get that for you, but it's 6 months out. That may have changed, but they're still sensitive to it. If you start to talk about that, and we don't want to lie, but if that is the reality that, hey, remember what happened, this could happen again, you're going to get some people going, oh my goodness, yeah, we better place an order. So they're coming fast now here. Reduced revenue from Elena. Aaron, operational costs versus initial capital expenses, total cost of ownership. Perfect. I've actually mentioned that a little bit later. By the way, if you're dealing with anybody in procurement and they're pushing back on price, and I'm going to talk about that shortly, but something I wanted to mention, always discuss total cost of ownership. That's what procurement people are trained to think about. Not all of them do. They often just focus on your unit price and say, well, that's too high. But you would always want to broaden that and say, well, when you include X, Y, right, with that, suddenly the total cost of ownership is much less. Clovis says, failure to build relationships. Absolutely. So it's going to depend on what you sell. But the point I want you to think about here moving forward is ultimately, what are the business impacts? And not just from a value prop statement, but from a standpoint of the different decision influencers, because you want to make it as easy as possible for your buyer, right, to make a buy decision. And by doing some of this work for them, right, you're going to make their life so much easier. Okay. All right, let's keep moving. Now, I know what you're thinking. That looks like a nice truck. And I thought the same when we bought it back late last summer. But actually, this is not the exact truck. It's same color, but similar truck, let's say it that way. But when we purchased this truck last year, I drove it home. So we bought it in Newmarket. I live a couple hours away, drove the truck home, and there was this vibration coming as I was driving the truck. So when I got home, I called the dealership and I said, something's going on. There's a vibration. They said, well, bring it back. We'll have a look. So the next weekend, drove 2 hours to take the truck back. They rebalanced the tires and I brought it back home again. What do you think happened when I got down the road on the way home? Vibration, right? Like, oh my goodness. So I called the dealer again. They said, well, bring it back, but it's got to be something to do with the tires. So I thought, well, I'm going to take it to a local dealership here. So I drove it to the dealership. I talked to the tech, explained what was going on. The tech says, okay, let me go talk to the service manager. We'll get you booked in. The service manager comes back out and he says to me, Sean, I understand you got a vibration in your truck. And I said, yeah. And he says, so what's been done to it so far? I said, well, the place I bought it from, the dealer I bought it from, have balanced the tires at least once, if not a couple times, but that hasn't fixed the issue. He says, okay, I want to share something with you. This specific year and model of truck has been known to have issues with vibrations coming from the rear end of differential. So that's the big round thing underneath the back of the truck that the axles are connected to. And he said that it's not a big deal to repair. The parts do exist. They're not parts that are typically on back order. But he said the issue is the repair can be upwards of over $3,000. So he says, what kind of warranty do you have in this truck? I said, well, I bought it used, so I think I got 30 days. He said, so, and now I've burned a couple of weeks here, right, by going back and forth. He said, I would very quickly get back to the other dealer and ask them to look into this and see what they come up with. So I called the other dealer, but I had no faith they were going to be able to figure this out. They were not a Ford dealership. So I told them, look, I'm going to take it to my local dealer, and I convinced them to let me do so to assess the issue. Guess what? That was the problem. $2,400 later, which fortunately the original dealer, to their credit, ended up paying for, the vibration is gone. So you might be thinking, okay, nice story. What does that have to do with selling? Well, when that manager, that shop manager came back to speak with me, okay, he could have just left it with the tech. The tech could have booked me in for, check the tire balance and maybe take it for a test drive. They could have called me and said, here's your quote to fix the problem. But he invested time to come out and talk to me, okay? There's an important point here I'll make in a second. What he did for me, though, was he identified a blind spot that I wasn't aware of and that the other dealer wasn't aware of. It was an issue that nobody was really aware of or thinking about when it came to this vibration. Everybody looked to the obvious, this is the key, not the not so obvious, right? Which is this bigger repair that could be the real issue and was the real issue. Now, here's the thing I wanted to tell you about the reason this story is so important. When it comes to dealing with that dealership locally, who do you think has my commitment to service now on that vehicle for the rest of my time with it? Right? It's that dealership. It's that shop manager. He invested the time in his busy schedule to come and educate me. He was right. And ultimately, they worked with the other dealer to make sure that everything got covered from a payment standpoint. So they've got my business for life. What I want to suggest to you is when it comes to selling, we often do what our competitors do, right? We make the same calls, we send very similar emails, maybe you're even using direct mail, which by the way is something I'd highly recommend in today's market, but we're doing many of the same things our competitors are doing, and we're not being provocative enough. And when the economy slows, most of us get fearful. We think, uh-oh. And so if we're talking to a buyer, we're almost in our mind thinking, oh my goodness, I hope they make the buy. I hope I can make this sale. That kind of mindset, unfortunately, it's usually picked up by others around us, right? When I was selling cars in my early 20s, they called me being desperate when I was like that. Because you're like, oh, really? Yeah, let's go into the office. I think it's gonna be the best car for you. When you behave in a manner that's not so desperate, guess what happens? You sell. It's so counterintuitive. It still blows my mind. I'm sure there's science there, but the point I want to make to you is when we are provocative, we're able to identify blind spots our buyers aren't thinking about. Now, this takes a little bit of effort. This takes blocking an hour in your calendar, sitting down with a piece of paper and a pen and saying, well, what are the things that my competitors are likely telling, right? The people I'm selling to, and what can I suggest that's different? Sometimes the way to get started is to take a statement that a competitor might use, like we've got the best warranty in the business, and simply flip it and say, you don't need the best warranty in the business, right? So let me use an example. So you identify that Jeepers, our competitors have much better warranties than ours do. They're much longer. So a way to be provocative, and again, you'd have to think through your language and approach here, but if you flip that, it's that, okay, you don't need longer warranties. What might that look like from a language standpoint? Well, I might say to a buyer, something I'm aware of is that some of our competitors who you're buying from today actually have warranties that are a year longer than ours. But here's why we're not longer. It's because the service history, the proven track record of our product results that we don't need a warranty. We have not had a warranty claim in the last 15 years. So the question I want you to think about, Mrs. Buyer, is why does that competitor you're dealing with have a long extended warranty and we don't? Right? So there's it. Now, I didn't practice that, so that may come out a little bit fuzzy, but you can imagine if you practice that a couple times, that is provocative. That might get some buyers at least thinking, oh yeah, good point. I never thought of that. How many warranty claims do they have? So we need to think about being provocative because that's how we get attention, especially when our buyers are really distracted, concerned, worried, maybe a little hesitant to meet with salespeople because we're not buying right now. So what I want you to think about is how can you be more provocative? Don't ask your buyers what's keeping them up at night. Tell them what should be keeping them up at night. And the way to do that, as I mentioned, is simply list out some statements that you know your competitors would share, and then test flipping them around and see if you can actually say them in a way that makes sense. They're truthful, okay? You want to, and that you can prove with some example, just like I did there. If we've had very few warranty claims even, that's something that I could share. And the way I flip that around is something that's going to get and keep a buyer's attention. So when the economy is slow and maybe buyers don't want to spend a lot of time with you, as we discussed at the beginning, you've got to be provocative in order to get and keep their attention, okay? Next thing I want you to consider here is avoid discounting. Now, I know what you're thinking. Again, depending on what you're selling, you may say, Sean, the only way I can make sales when the economy slows down is to discount. My competitors discount. I'm not here to tell you what you should and shouldn't do. I'm here to give you some ideas of what does work for other companies and other sales professionals, okay? And there's an issue with discounting. Now, I worked with an organization last year where they were in a, let's say, a sector where price was always being pushed down, constantly pushed down. And what we did is we worked on negotiations training. And I want to tell you, one of the main takeaways from that training was the fact that negotiation is not a component of your sales process. It is your sales process. Right? We're negotiating from the very point we get their attention. This entire process, this entire sales process is a negotiation. But when it comes to discounting, we can actually set ourselves apart by not discounting, or at least not leading with a discount. Okay, so here's a few rules I want you to consider when it comes to people pushing back on your price, which happens a lot during economic slowdowns, right? If we cave to pricing pressure, it leaves our buyer wondering, how low will they go? Okay. Now, let me tell you a secret here. And I don't tell many people this, but I'll tell the 52 of you here and the 100 that signed up a little secret. Earlier in my career, I worked in procurement. I worked in purchasing. This is not a statement that I thought up because I thought it sounded cool. This is what I knew to be the case. As soon as somebody decided, if my role was to ask for a better price, I never knew if I was going to get it or not. And sometimes I had absolutely no leverage behind it, but I asked anyways. And if they said, yeah, we can discount that down to XYZ, what do you think I thought? Oh, interesting. Should I have asked for more of a discount? Can they go lower? That's what procurement people in particular are thinking if you cave to pricing. Now, again, I'm not here to tell you what your pricing strategy should be. I'm just saying as sales professionals, if we jump to discounting too quickly, it leaves a question in our buyer's mind, which can impact trust. It can impact rapport. Okay, so something for you to consider. The next thing I want you to consider is that objections, pushback, and counteroffers are a sign of interest. Anybody here, I guess nobody's going to raise their hand probably, but anybody here ever get a call ultimately to your phone at the most inopportune time and you answer it, right? And there's somebody on the other line that ultimately it's some sort of cold call, right? And we hang up, at least I hang up. If I can tell it's a cold call, I'm hanging up. Now, if that person has something that interests me, I stay on the phone. When it comes to objections, pushback, counteroffers, if your buyer wasn't interested to some degree in whatever it is you're selling, they just wouldn't respond, period. End of story. They wouldn't reply to your email. They wouldn't answer your call. They wouldn't stay on the phone. They wouldn't meet for lunch, right? So if somebody has an objection or they push back on your pricing, there's still something there. And it's not necessarily they're looking for a discount. They're looking for what you're selling, but we haven't really figured out yet what it is that's going to make that happen. So don't be scared. Don't be frightened by objections or pushback. They're a sign of interest. They're still hanging on because there's something there. Okay. And the last thing I want you to consider is that value influences price. The greater the perception of value of your product or service, the higher the expected price. Nobody expects to get a new Tesla for $22,000. And in fact, I saw one on a website for $30,000. And guess what? Right? There was something wrong with it. It had been in an accident. So we know when it comes to price that value and price go hand in hand. So again, we want to make sure we keep the value of our product or service up, and the way we do that is by sustaining our price. Okay, sticking firm, if you will, staying firm on your price. All right. So 3 things I want you to consider when it comes to price. Don't jump to discounting. Here's the last thing I want to share with you. There was a study done by the Harvard Business School, and this professor, Gerald Zaltman, and the main conclusion of the study was that 95% of our purchase decisions take place unconsciously. Now, what was behind that was the fact that when it comes to decisions that are being made, what tends to happen is it's our subconscious mind that makes decisions. So we take information in, right? Again, go back to that initial slide where we talked about research. We take information in. Our subconscious mind has its method and process for processing that information, but then it's emotional triggers in our conscious mind that flag the decision. So think about that in real life, okay? You're maybe having some problems with your car. You've taken it into the shop. You've got a repair bill, $400 here, $1,000 there, another $300. At some point, you might be thinking, maybe it's time to get a new car. And then you start to process, well, of course, you go to Facebook and it shows you a new car because it realizes you searched on Google, right? But the other thing that's going to happen is you're going to be thinking about and taking in information about cars. You're going to be asking your friends what they pay for their car, what's their monthly payment, right? You're going to be comparing ultimately that monthly payment against your monthly maintenance costs, right? So all this is going to start to happen, but it's not going to be until the next time your car breaks down or the next time you go by a dealer is having a big sale, right? A big flashy sale, that the emotional trigger happens and you say, hold on a second, let me go take a look at a new car, right? So what I want you to realize is from our buyer's standpoint, they're taking information in, but it's emotional triggers that makes them buy. Now you might be thinking, okay, what does that have to do with me, Sean? Well, when it comes to emotional triggers, we've got to use emotional triggers to demonstrate, to promote urgency. Now, how do you do this? We use more emotional language, both in the speaking that we're doing, so the conversations we're having, but also in the communications we have, from emails to even our proposals or quotes. Now, emotional language, if you don't have this, I would highly recommend you pick up the book called Words That Sell. I have my copy, but it's not sitting here close. Words That Sell is all about taking existing words and phrases and turning them into more emotional words and statements that you can use in a variety of ways. The whole book is full of that, and it's about that thick. So there's a lot in there. But for example, rather than saying this is new, I could say it's never seen before, it's unheard of. Rather than say surprise, I could say shocked, disdain, stunned, revelation, excuse me. And the point here is that these are emotional laden words, which can support the triggers that you're trying to use with your buyers. So during these economic slowdowns, in order to get our buyers to act on the sale, we've got to focus on using more emotional language, right, to compel them to make a buy decision. Now, there's a whole psychology behind this I'm not going to go through today, but I would suggest if there's one thing you do, grab this book and start to practice using these kinds of words and phrases in your discussions with buyers. You're going to find that's going to compel them, notice that's an emotional word, to make changes, to make decisions. Okay. And if you're selling something that is, let's say, software, it's highly technical in nature, that's where you can get into trouble, because we tend to explain the technical aspects of what it is we're selling, but our buyer, oftentimes they might not care, but if they do care, we're just giving them logic, we're giving them information. What we've got to do is use emotion to get them to take action. Okay. And we can do that through emotional language. The other thing I want you to consider is what I mentioned a few minutes ago. We want to incorporate scarcity. Now, many of you, I know from working at least with some of you, use scarcity a lot during COVID. And it's because it was true. We couldn't get anything. I remember I called one gentleman. He said, Sean, we don't need sales training. We need somebody to help our supply chain. Then we can get sales training. I don't want to sell anything more right now. And I said, okay, I hope that's not a short-sighted view. And sure enough, he was calling me about a year later saying, oh my gosh, we need to sell more. But nonetheless, we as sales professionals can still use scarcity. We don't want to lie. That's not the point here. But people are uber sensitive to what they've just gone through, which is I can't get things I need in quick order. We want to use that to our advantage. So for example, if your lead time maybe in the past has been 8 weeks and now it's down to 4, the point is that your buyer wants it likely now. Once they make the decision, they go through all that, they want it now. So when you're getting up to the point where you think you've got them, you could say, look, there's something I want to share with you. Our lead times range from 4 weeks, which is current, upwards, I've even seen 8 weeks. I know this is something that's important to you to introduce quickly if you decide to do so. I just want to be upfront with you that this is not something that we can probably happen quickly. But the faster you can make a decision or make a commitment of some kind, I can at least put your name on one of these, which will hold it so that as the final decision comes through, you're ultimately going to have your name and you're going to get it when you want it. Now, you might say, well, how do I make that happen, Sean? That can be different types of agreement letters that you use, right? Letters of intent, all those things, if that's something that your company is comfortable with. But the point I'm making here is some sales professionals I know have said, I'm not using the scarcity thing, Sean, because people are tired of it. No, they're sensitive to it. It works better than ever. So you should be incorporating it. Again, with the idea, we're not here to lie or mislead people, but use it to your advantage because it's an emotional trigger that can get our buyers ultimately to take action. Here's the very last point. I think I said the last one was the last point. So this is the bonus point. Let's call it that. What I want you to focus on then, remember we keep coming back to that word focus, is your time. Now, you might say, okay, Sean, my time is full. I've got meetings with my boss. I've got meetings with my sales team. I've got meetings with existing accounts. I've got all of this happening, which consumes a lot of my time. Well, when it comes to slower economic times, we really need to focus our attention on revenue generating activities. Here's an exercise for you to do. Take your calendar, take a look at maybe next week and identify in your calendar how many of those items are revenue generating. Now, let me tell you what is not revenue generating, okay? A meeting with an existing client who cannot buy more, right? That's just an account management meeting to me. There's no opportunity to sell them more. You're just maintaining that relationship, right? Meetings with the sales team, meetings with your managers, those aren't helping you generate more revenue unless maybe there's some training you're participating in. But when I say revenue generating activities, what I'm talking about is times blocked in your calendars, which are meetings with prospects, discussions with prospects, presentations to prospects, and or existing buyers or customers that you're working with who can buy more. You can upsell them to the next level. You can cross-sell them another product or service. Look at and highlight all of those in your calendar and count up how much time that takes. Because if you're in sales and your role is to generate new sales, 50% of your time in a week should be on revenue generating activities. 50%. I'm going to suggest that many of you, and I've seen this time and time again, even if we highlight some of those activities that are kind of on the border of revenue generation, you're probably 25 to 30% of your time. That's not everybody, but many of you. And the challenge for you is going to be to go to your boss and say, I got a problem. The economy's slowing down a bit. This guy named Sean told me I need to focus on revenue generating activities. I looked at my calendar and there's a lot of time here I don't think are revenue generating. Can you help me get out of some of these meetings, move some of these meetings, shorten some of these meetings down so I can gain back more time to generate more revenue. Most leaders in sales are going to be receptive to that. Some won't. You can decide what you do after that point. But my point is, if you want to make sales, you've really got to focus in on how you invest your time during these slow times. And it starts with your calendar. Okay. So here's the kind of how I wanted to end this. When it comes to selling, okay, especially during downtimes, if you're saying, well, Sean, I don't have a lot of prospects to work with, maybe something you're selling, you've already got most of the market. I'm talking to a company right now that based on what they're selling, they've got most of the market already. There's not much more to sell to. So the question has to become, well, what are the other opportunities to sell existing accounts or existing customers that I have? And essentially, there's really 4 opportunities you have with every single account to sell. There's the initial sale that you make, obvious. There's the upsell. So if you can sell them more volume, if you can sell them more coverage, if you can sell them additional investments, right? Whatever the case might be. There's the resell, which means after whatever term it is up or the equipment is failing, right? There's the resell opportunity. And then there's referrals. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, I want you during these slower times to really focus on referrals. They're such an easy door opener, and it's going to be so much less stressful for you than trying to call up people that are, themselves stressed, worried about the economy, and they're just going to say to you what we've all heard at some point, which is, yeah, we're not buying today, right? So if you focus on referrals, it's a much easier, less stressful way to get in the door and start to have these conversations. But always keep in mind that for every sale you make, there's really at least 4 sales, and referrals, there could be dozens, right? So this could go on and on and on. But for every sale, there's at least 4 opportunities to make an additional sale. And if you're in an economic slowdown, go to your existing accounts where you've made the initial sale and try and capture those other 3 areas. Okay. The other thing I wanted to mention here at the just to kind of wrap up is a little bit of a summary. So we've talked about 5 different areas that I want you to focus on when it comes to selling during a down economy. Number 1, have clear business impacts that not only impact your buyer, but the decision makers and decision influencers, right? We talked about those. Be provocative, stand out. Don't say what your competitors are saying. Flip those statements and see if you can prove them out so that you get the attention and keep the attention of your buyer. Avoid discounting. Remember, push back on price. It's to be expected, and it's a sign of interest. And if you do jump to discounting quickly, you really leave in the mind of your buyer the question, how low will they go, right? Which is not what you want to do. Introduce urgency in your offer. Use more emotional language in both your conversations, your quotes, your presentations, right? We want to compel our buyers to buy. And remember, scarcity is something people are still very sensitive to, so it's a good tool to use. And we want to control our time. I want you to focus most of your time, if you can, on revenue generating activities. And that might be something you need to engage your manager with. But I think you're going to find if you can show some results, they're going to be willing to support you in that manner. Okay. So I had said this, I'm going to open up for questions here. But before I do that, I just want to end on this. When it comes to selling, this guy kind of creeps me out a bit, but when it comes to selling, I want you to be thinking this, that you're trying to sell as the economy is shifting and changing. So is your competitor. Right? They're having the same, they might actually be online here with you right now. I don't think they are. I think you've got a hand up on them. And just by being here, you're proving, hey, that you're willing to try some new things and different things. But your competitors have their strategies. You've got to be different than them. You've got to be different. You've got to do things differently. You've got to speak differently. You got to present differently if you really want to get the attention of your buyer, because you're the main point of contact for any conversation about sales. So if nothing else, try to do things differently than what your competitors are doing, right? Set yourself apart. That's going to be the way that you're going to be able to actually get and keep the attention and make sales during economic slowdowns. Now, I'd said to Ruplan, I would say this briefly. So here's my ask and my offer to you. So my publisher, I've got another book coming out this August, and my publisher has said, hey, Sean, we don't have enough Amazon reviews for the Unstoppable Sales Machine. The ones that are on there are good, but we don't have a lot of them. So he said, I need more reviews from you. So here's my offer. If you are interested in a copy of the book and you promise to me you'll do a review, preferably a good one, but it's up to you ultimately, reach out to me via email. I'll send you a copy with just a print off of the instructions. The reviews are really easy to do in Amazon. And that would be a kind of a good give and take. If the book would help you, that'd be great. And if you could do a review, that would help me as well. You can email me at, well, you see it in the upper right there. It's my name, Sean at SeanCasemore.com. So with that said, I'm going to turn it back over to Ruplan for questions.
Thanks so much, Sean, and thanks so much for that offer. Again, that's Sean at seancasmore.com for that book. And we'll open up for questions now. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to put them into the chat and we can address them. We've got a few minutes.
Mm-hmm. I see Greg put a good, Greg Billings put a good example in the chat there about finding success in negotiating a price discount, trading for a price concession, right? You have to think about building value in these cases too. How can I increase the value of what it is I'm selling? And again, depending on what you sell, that could be volume, it can be extended term. It's a lot easier to double up on something and reduce the price a little bit than to sell one and reduce that price, right? Because your company can often spread that margin a lot easier over two products or two services. So any questions? Last time there was a gap and then we got 32 of them. Here we go. You said that you hang up on cold callers. As a cold caller, what would you need to hear to not hang up on me? It wasn't very encouraging to hear a salesperson hangs up on cold callers. Yeah, well, let me explain that further. These are the cold callers that you will get where there's a big long sigh because they're using a call machine, like that big gap. And then you hear a click and then you hear a hello, hello, right? Those are the cold callers I hang up on. If somebody has a sales presentation or pitch, I listen to them. But here's what I would suggest. You need to start the call with volume and enthusiasm, but not so overwhelming that it's going to scare somebody. So of Rupelin, and I'm just looking at her in the chair. So actually, I'll use yourself, Josh. If you were to call me, or I was to call you, better yet, when you would answer, I would say, "Hey, Josh, it's Sean Casemore calling. Sorry to call you out of the blue, but I just had a quick question for you." Something like that. Enthusiasm. The other thing to mention, Josh, is I use calling with the idea that I'm probably going to get voicemail. So what I do is I use the idea that I'm going to leave a message that drives them to my email. That way, if I do send an email as a follow-up, chances are they're going to look for it because my message is, "Hey, it's Sean calling. I just wanted to reach out. I was going to send you an email, but thought this might be an easier way to connect." And then I explain quickly my little one sentence statement that you've got probably for your product or service. And then you say, "I'm going to send you an email now. Looking forward to connect. If you'd like to speak to me directly," then you give your number and you hang up. That's how I use cold calling. It drives to an email. So we got Bruce. You just did the exact same thing. Trading review for a book, a great offer. My position. Oh, thanks, Bruce. I thought you were going to give me heck for that. So I appreciate that. Josh is awesome. Hopefully that was helpful, Josh. Feel free to email me, anybody, if you want those scenarios. I enjoy actually going through some of those. It did. Let me get back up here. I did miss a couple.
There's one from Giovanni here.
Yeah, Giovanni. From your real world life experiences, can you make comments on magnify the hurt and bring the solutions? Let me say what you said differently, because I've never been a proponent of the pain, the hurt, that kind of idea. But I'll tell you a conversation I had this morning. So this is somebody who I was doing some work with, and the person I was dealing with left. And now the owner of the company is just trying to catch up. Now, initially, like anybody else, I'm panicked that, okay, are we done work here? Because we had made a big plan and now it's all stopped. But when we had a call this morning, what I tell myself is I'm going to put myself in their shoes. And when I do that, I knew that, okay, he's had a key person leave. He doesn't care about me right now. He's just trying to figure out what's going on. And so I started the conversation with that. I said, if, having been connected with folks such as yourselves, I would imagine right now that you're dealing with X and Y. Is that correct? And he said, absolutely it is. That sets a different tone for the conversation. So my motto is, or my method is, put myself in their shoes. And if I don't know what that is, I ask an existing customer what kind of challenges they're experiencing, then I use that. And then that's how I start the conversation. I find it brings their guard down. And then we can start to talk about, and I'll ask, so what kind of solutions are you looking at? What kind of solutions are you introducing to deal with this situation? So that's more my approach. I don't know if that's helpful or if it answers the question, but hopefully it is. Clovis says, love it. So that's great. Any other questions at all? I mean, the question period is the most fun. Probably most of you are looking at the lunch bell here and wondering, any thoughts on how to punch up the variations on do you have time for a brief call to discuss further? Greg, I think it depends on what you sell. So I just test different ones. I literally write out different statements, and then I'll spend a day or a couple days making calls, and I'll test the different ones. And I'm looking for a few things. Obviously, what is the response I get, right? And the better response I get, the more often I'll use it to further validate that. But also what I'll sometimes do is test them out in existing customers. If you've got a good relationship, most customers are fine if you call them and say, look, I'm trying to reach out to other companies similar to yourself. And by the way, have I asked you for a referral lately? Ha ha. Then I pause and wait for one. But then I said, look, this is how I'm reaching out. What I'm saying, is this something that would get your attention? you'd be shocked how many of your good accounts will say, actually, no, it wouldn't. Here's what would, or I heard a cool thing last week. So use existing accounts and mine them for information and ideas about how to approach other accounts. You'd be shocked at how willing they are to help if you have a good relationship. Yeah, there is a lot of emotional language in pharmaceutical, especially after the last couple of years. Okay, so I'm just making sure I didn't miss anything. I see Greg's got a comment there. Any thoughts? Okay, so hopefully, Greg, I answered your question. Any other questions at all?
Yep.
Nope. Okay. All right.
Oh,
I think somebody's off mute. Ruplan, I guess I'll turn it back over to you for any final closing information or updates.
Well, huge thank you to you, Sean, for this great presentation for everybody who's attended today's session. In case you missed it a little bit earlier in today's presentation, for those of you on the CPSA designation pathway, or if you are maintaining your professional development units, this session is worth 1 PDU. And as a new offering, brand new, all of our attendees are going to receive a certificate of participation right after this session, accompanying the recording, which is shareable and downloadable on LinkedIn. And for all of our upcoming webinars, workshops coming up, head on over to cpsa.com/events, where you'll find the rest of them to register there. Huge thanks to everybody today. And thank you, Sean. Have a great day, everybody.
Yeah, nice to meet everybody. Keep your head up, by the way. Keep your head up. We made it through COVID. We'll get through this.
Thanks, Sean. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, everybody.